Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in rural Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1924 in Appomattox County, Virginia, carried with it an unusual heaviness. The tobacco harvest had been poor, the leaves brittle and yellowed before their time, and an early frost had settled over the rolling hills that surrounded the Bellamys property. Located 7 miles northeast of the county seat, down a winding dirt road that branched off from what locals called the Old Richmond Pike, the Bellamys farm occupied 340 acres of what had once been prosperous agricultural land. The property had been in the family since 1867, when Cornelius Bellamy, a Union veteran from Connecticut, had purchased the land from a Confederate widow whose husband had died at Cold Harbor. Cornelius had brought with him his wife, Minerva, and their ambitious plans to establish a successful farming operation in the post-war South. By all accounts, the early years had been challenging but promising. The house itself, a substantial 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and distinctive Gothic Revival windows, had been completed in 1869 using local fieldstone and timber cut from the property's own woods. What distinguished the Bellamy property from neighboring farms was not the house, however, but the barn. Constructed in 1871, it was larger than typical for a farm of that size, measuring nearly 80 feet in length and 40 feet in width. Local craftsmen had noted at the time that Cornelius Bellamy had insisted on specific modifications to the standard design, including an unusually deep foundation that extended nearly 8 feet below ground level and interior walls that were built with double thickness. The barn's most peculiar feature was a series of small shuttered windows positioned just above the foundation line. Windows that seemed to serve no practical purpose for storing hay or housing the livestock. Cornelius Bellamy died in 1889, leaving the property to his son Mordecai, who had married a local woman named Prudence Garnett 2 years earlier. Mordecai was known throughout the county as a taciturn man, methodical in his farming practices, but increasingly withdrawn from community activities. Unlike his father, who had been active in local politics and frequently attended the Methodist church in town, Mordecai rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of his property, except when absolutely necessary for business. County records from the 1890s reveal that the Bellamy farm was financially sound, producing adequate crops and maintaining a small but profitable livestock operation. However, several neighbors later recalled that sometime around 1892, the character of the property began to change in subtle but noticeable ways. The vegetable garden that Prudence had maintained near the house was abandoned, and the family stopped selling surplus produce at the weekly market in town. More significantly, they ceased attending church services entirely, a decision that raised eyebrows in a community where Sunday worship was considered essential to social standing. Dr. Josiah Whitmore, the county physician who occasionally visited the farm during the 1890s, kept detailed notes on his calls to the Bellamy property. These notes, discovered in 1963 during the settlement of his grandson's estate, provide insight into the gradual transformation of the family's circumstances. In an entry dated September 15, 1893, Dr. Whitmore wrote, "Called to attend Mrs. Bellamy for what her husband described as a recurring fever. Found the patient in a state of considerable nervous agitation, complaining of persistent insomnia and an inability to remain in certain areas of the house, particularly the kitchen and the room directly above it. The husband's manner was evasive when questioned about the duration and onset of these symptoms." A subsequent entry, dated November 3, 1893, is more revealing. Mrs. Bellamy's condition appears to have worsened, despite the tonics prescribed during my previous visit. She speaks in hushed tones of sounds from below, and insists that the foundation of the house has been disturbed. Mr. Bellamy maintains that his wife is suffering from nervous exhaustion, but I observe that he too appears increasingly haggard. More concerning is his request for laudanum in quantities that exceed what would be reasonable for his wife's condition alone. When pressed, he admitted to his own sleeplessness, claiming that the property requires constant vigilance during the night hours. The last entry in Dr. Whitmore's notes regarding the Bellamys is dated February 14, 1894. Summoned urgently to the Bellamy farm, but upon arrival was informed that my services were no longer required. Mr. Bellamy met me at the property entrance and stated that his wife had recovered fully. However, I observed through the front window a figure that I believed to be Mrs. Bellamy, standing motionless in what appeared to be the parlor. The figure remained completely still during the entire duration of my brief conversation with Mr. Bellamy, and I confessed to a sensation of unease regarding her condition. Mr. Bellamy's appearance was markedly deteriorated, with a gaunt countenance and a nervous manner of constantly glancing toward the barn during our exchange. Following Dr. Whitmore's final visit, the Bellamys effectively disappeared from community life. They stopped receiving mail delivery, ceased all commercial transactions with local merchants, and no longer employed the seasonal workers who had previously helped with harvesting. The farm appeared to continue operating as neighbors occasionally observed smoke rising from the chimney and detected the sounds of agricultural activity, but no one from the family was seen in town for months at a time. Deacon Ezra Thornfield of the Methodist Church recorded in his personal diary his concern about the Bellamys' absence from religious services. In March 1894, he decided to pay a pastoral visit to the farm. His diary entry describing this visit, preserved in the church archives, provides a disturbing glimpse into the conditions at the property. Arrived at the Bellamy farm after midday to find the main house in apparent good repair, though the window shutters were drawn despite the pleasant spring weather. Mr. Bellamy emerged from the barn upon my approach, carrying what appeared to be carpentry tools. His greeting was cordial but hurried, and he expressed appreciation for my concern while firmly declining my offer to provide spiritual counsel. Mrs. Bellamy was not present, though Mr. Bellamy assured me she was well and engaged in household duties. Deacon Thornfield's entry continues. What disturbed me most profoundly was the sound emanating from the barn during our conversation. It was rhythmic, like the slow beating of a drum, but with a hollow quality that I cannot adequately describe. When I inquired about this sound, Mr. Bellamy's demeanor changed noticeably, and he explained that he was engaged in construction work to expand the barn's storage capacity. However, the sound did not correspond to any carpentry activity with which I am familiar, and it continued with such regularity that it seemed almost mechanized. The deacon's final observation proved particularly prescient. As I departed, I glanced back at the property and observed Mr. Bellamy still standing outside the barn, but he was no longer alone. A second figure had emerged, presumably Mrs. Bellamy, though the distance and the shadow cast by the barn's overhang made identification difficult. What struck me as unusual was that both figures remained absolutely motionless, standing side by side, watching my departure. Even after I had traveled some distance down the road, they maintained the same positions. It occurred to me that their stillness was more reminiscent of sentinels than of farmers taking a brief respite from their labors. For the next 3 years, the Bellamy farm existed in a state of eerie isolation. Neighbors reported occasional sightings of figures moving about the property, particularly near the barn, but these observations were always from a distance and often occurred during twilight hours when clear identification was impossible. The property continued to show signs of agricultural activity, with crops planted and harvested in season, but the methods employed appeared increasingly irregular. Isaiah Watkins, whose own farm bordered the Bellamy property to the east, later testified to county authorities about the changes he observed during this period. According to a deposition taken in 1962, Watkins stated, "The Bellamys had always been particular about their land management, keeping their fields in neat rows and their livestock properly penned. But starting in the mid-1890s, their farming practices became erratic. They began working primarily at night, which any farmer will tell you is highly impractical. You could hear the sounds of plowing and planting after midnight, sometimes continuing until just before dawn." Watkins also reported a more troubling development. The smell from their property changed around this time. Previously, it had carried the normal odors of a working farm, hay, livestock, turned earth. But by 1895, there was something else, something that reminded me of the battlefield hospitals during the war. It was particularly strong when the wind blew from the direction of their barn, and it was most noticeable during the summer months when the weather was hot and still. The mystery of the Bellamy farm deepened in the autumn of 1897 when Samuel Hodges, a traveling preacher who occasionally conducted services in rural areas, reported a disturbing encounter while seeking shelter during a thunderstorm. Hodges had been traveling the old Richmond Pike when the storm struck, and seeing the lights of the Bellamy farmhouse, he had approached seeking temporary refuge. In a letter to his denomination's regional headquarters, Hodges described his reception at the farm. "The gentleman who answered my knock was courteous, but appeared considerably aged since my last encounter with the family several years prior. He invited me to shelter in the barn rather than the house, explaining that his wife was indisposed and required quiet. I gratefully accepted, as the storm was severe and my horse needed protection from the elements." Hodges continued, "The interior of the barn was unlike any agricultural structure I had previously encountered. The central area had been cleared of the typical implements and storage materials one would expect, and the floor appeared to have been excavated and then refilled, creating an uneven surface that was difficult to navigate in the lamplight. Along the walls were arranged numerous wooden containers, rectangular in shape and of uniform size, each approximately 6 feet in length. Mr. Bellamy explained that these were storage boxes for preserving seed grain through the winter months, though their construction seemed unnecessarily robust for such a purpose." The preacher's letter takes a more ominous tone as he describes the remainder of his stay. "During the night, I was awakened by sounds from beneath the barn floor. Initially, I attributed these disturbances to the settling of the building during the storm, but the noises continued with a regularity that suggested deliberate activity. There was a scratching sound, intermittent but persistent, as though someone were attempting to dig through wooden planking from below. Most disturbing was the occasional sound of what I can only describe as muffled speech, though the words were indistinguishable." Hodges concluded his letter with an observation that would later prove significant. "When morning came and the storm had passed, I noticed that several of the storage containers had been rearranged during the night, though I had not observed Mr. Bellamy entering the barn. Additionally, the earth floor showed signs of recent disturbance in multiple locations, as though it had been repeatedly dug up and refilled. Mr. Bellamy's manner during my departure was notably agitated, and he repeatedly urged me to continue my journey without delay. I confess that I was grateful to leave that place, as the atmosphere had become increasingly oppressive throughout my stay." The letter was filed in the denominational archives and forgotten until 1964, when a graduate student researching rural religious practices in post-Civil War Virginia discovered it while examining correspondence from traveling ministers. The timing of this discovery would prove fortuitous, as it occurred just 2 years before county authorities would have reason to investigate the Bellamy property in detail. The first official intervention at the Bellamy farm came in early 1898, when County Tax Assessor Marcus Whitfield arrived to conduct the annual property evaluation required by Virginia law. Whitfield, a meticulous man who had been performing assessments in Appomattox County for over a decade, found the Bellamy property in a state that defied easy categorization. In his official report, filed with the county courthouse on March 12, 1898, Whitfield wrote, "Property shows signs of continued habitation and agricultural use, though methods employed appear unconventional. Main house structure is sound, but owner declined to permit interior inspection, citing his wife's illness. Barn and outbuildings show evidence of recent modifications, including extensive excavation work and installation of additional drainage systems. Owner stated that these improvements were necessary for proper grain storage, though the modifications appear excessive for declared purpose." Whitfield's report includes a hand-drawn diagram of the property layout, noting the positions of various structures and the locations of what he described as irregularities in ground level throughout the barnyard area. This diagram would later prove valuable to investigators, as it documented the extent of the excavation work that had been conducted on the property over several years. More significantly, Whitfield's report contained an addendum that he initially hesitated to include. "During the course of my inspection, I was repeatedly distracted by sounds emanating from the barn structure. These sounds were inconsistent with typical agricultural activities and occurred with such regularity that they seemed to follow a predetermined pattern. When I inquired about the source of these disturbances, Mr. Bellamy explained that he was engaged in carpentry work to construct additional storage facilities. However, I observed no evidence of lumber or other construction materials, and the sounds resembled the rhythmic impact of a tool against earth rather than the hammering associated with carpentry." The tax assessor's visit marked the last documented official contact with the Bellamy family for several months. However, neighbors continued to report unusual activities on the property, particularly during the winter of 1898-1899. The sounds of nighttime excavation became more frequent, and several residents of the area reported seeing lights in the barn during hours when such activities would normally cease. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, who lived approximately 1 mile from the Bellamy farm, maintained a detailed diary of daily events that included numerous references to her neighbor's increasingly strange behavior. Her entries from this period, discovered among family papers in 1961, provide a civilian perspective on the situation as it deteriorated. On January 15, 1899, she wrote, "The sounds from the Bellamy place were particularly loud last night, continuing past 3 in the morning. Jeremiah rode over this morning to inquire if they required assistance, but found no one at the main house, though smoke was rising from the chimney. The barn door was secured with a new lock, and there was evidence of fresh digging in the area surrounding the building." Mrs. Ashworth's entry for February 3, 1899, reveals a growing concern among the local community. Reverend Morrison organized a group of church members to visit the Bellamys with provisions, as no one has seen them in town for months. The delegation returned before noon, reporting that Mr. Bellamy met them at the property boundary and politely declined their assistance. He appeared gaunt and spoke in a hurried manner, repeatedly glancing toward the barn during the conversation. Most troubling was his insistence that his wife was too ill to receive visitors. Yet several members of the delegation reported hearing multiple voices coming from the barn during their brief stay. The situation reached a crisis point in March 1899 when Dr. Whitmore received an urgent summons to attend to an emergency at the Bellamy farm. This would prove to be the last documented visit by an outsider to the property while the family remained in residence. Dr. Whitmore's notes from this visit, written in a hurried hand that differs markedly from his usual precise script, provide a harrowing glimpse into the conditions he encountered. "Arrived at the Bellamy property at approximately 4 p.m. in response to urgent request for medical assistance," Dr. Whitmore wrote. found Mr. Bellamy in a state of extreme agitation, claiming that his wife had suffered a serious accident and required immediate attention. However, when I requested to examine Mrs. Bellamy, Mr. Bellamy became evasive, stating that she was resting and could not be disturbed. His physical appearance was shocking. He had lost considerable weight and displayed all the symptoms of chronic sleep deprivation. The physician's notes continue with increasing concern. Mr. Bellamy's behavior became increasingly erratic during my visit. He repeatedly insisted that I examine the contents of several wooden containers in the barn, claiming that they contained medical specimens that required professional evaluation. Upon closer inspection, I found these containers to be sealed wooden boxes, each measuring approximately 6 feet in length and 2 feet in width. Mr. Bellamy stated that they contained preserved anatomical specimens that he had collected for scientific study, though he possessed no medical training that would justify such a collection. Dr. Whitmore's final entry regarding this visit is particularly disturbing. I demanded to see Mrs. Bellamy before providing any medical assistance, at which point Mr. Bellamy's demeanor changed dramatically. He led me to the barn, where he indicated several of the wooden containers. "She is resting," he said. "They are all resting." When I attempted to examine the containers more closely, Mr. Bellamy became violent, striking me with a farming implement and ordering me to leave the property immediately. I departed without providing any medical care, and with serious concerns about Mrs. Bellamy's welfare and safety. Dr. Whitmore reported his concerns to County Sheriff Amos Turnbull, leading to the first official law enforcement visit to the Bellamy property. Sheriff Turnbull's report, filed on March 15, 1899, documents his unsuccessful attempt to conduct a welfare check on Mrs. Bellamy and his growing suspicions about the activities at the farm. Proceeded to the Bellamy property with Deputy Clarence Hood to investigate reports of possible domestic disturbance and to verify the welfare of Mrs. Prudence Bellamy, Sheriff Turnbull wrote. Found the main house secured and apparently empty, though the chimney showed evidence of recent use. Mr. Mordecai Bellamy emerged from the barn upon our arrival and stated that his wife was visiting relatives in Richmond. When requested to provide details of these relatives or the duration of her visit, Mr. Bellamy became uncooperative and demanded that we leave his property. The sheriff's report continues. Observed that the barn had been extensively modified since my last visit to the property several years ago. The interior had been excavated to a considerable depth, and numerous wooden containers were arranged along the walls. Mr. Bellamy claimed these were storage containers for grain and agricultural supplies, but several appeared to be sealed with wax or another waterproof substance, which would be unnecessary for grain storage. Additionally, the barn floor showed evidence of repeated excavation and refilling, creating an uneven surface that would be impractical for normal agricultural use. Most significantly, Sheriff Turnbull noted, during our inspection, Deputy Hood and I both observed that several of the wooden containers showed signs of movement from within, as though the contents were shifting or settling. When we inquired about this, Mr. Bellamy explained that the containers held grain that was still drying, though the movement appeared too vigorous for such an explanation. Mr. Bellamy became increasingly agitated during our questioning and eventually ordered us to leave his property, claiming that we had no legal authority to continue our inspection. Sheriff Turnbull concluded his report with a recommendation for further investigation. Mr. Bellamy's behavior and the conditions observed at his property warrant continued monitoring. The whereabouts of Mrs. Prudence Bellamy remain unverified, and the unusual modifications to the barn structure suggest activities that may not be consistent with normal agricultural practices. I recommend that a formal investigation be conducted to determine the nature of the materials being stored in the wooden containers and to verify the welfare of all residents of the property. However, before any formal investigation could be initiated, The mystery of the Bellamys farm took an unexpected turn. On March 22, 1899, exactly 1 week after Sheriff Turnbull's visit, a massive fire broke out on the property during the early morning hours. The blaze, which was visible from several neighboring farms, completely destroyed the barn and severely damaged the main house. By the time volunteer firefighters could respond, the barn had been reduced to a smoldering foundation filled with charred debris. Fire Chief Elias Morton's report on the incident, preserved in county archives, described the destruction as complete. The barn structure was entirely consumed by flames by the time our brigade arrived. The intensity of the fire suggests the use of an accelerant, though Mr. Bellamy claimed that stored hay and grain had caused the rapid spread of the blaze. The main house sustained significant damage to its western wall and roof, rendering it uninhabitable. Most importantly, Chief Morton's report noted, "During our efforts to extinguish the remaining flames, firefighters observed that the barn's foundation had been excavated to a depth of approximately 8 feet, far deeper than would be necessary for normal agricultural storage. The excavated area was filled with charred wooden containers and other debris, making it impossible to determine the original contents." Mr. Bellamy stated that the containers had held grain and farming supplies, but several firefighters reported observing what appeared to be fabric remnants and other materials inconsistent with agricultural storage. The fire effectively ended any possibility of determining what had been stored in the barn's mysterious wooden containers. Mordecai Bellamy and his wife disappeared immediately after the fire, leaving no forwarding address and abandoning the property to the county for unpaid taxes. Attempts to locate them proved unsuccessful, and they vanished completely from official records. The burned remains of the Bellamy farm were eventually sold at a tax auction in 1901 to a speculator who planned to subdivide the land for resale. However, when workers began clearing the debris from the barn's foundation, they made discoveries that rekindled interest in the property's dark history. Mixed among the charred wooden containers were numerous personal items that seemed inconsistent with the agricultural storage that Mordecai Bellamy had claimed. Foreman Jesse Crawford, who supervised the cleanup operation, later provided a sworn statement to county authorities describing what his crew had found. "We uncovered more than 24 wooden boxes that had been only partially destroyed by the fire. Most contained charred grain and agricultural materials as expected, but several revealed items that seemed out of place. We found jewelry, clothing fragments, and what appeared to be personal effects that would not normally be stored in a barn. Most disturbing were several containers that held what looked like preserved organic materials, though the fire damage made precise identification impossible." Crawford's statement, given in 1962 to a county historian researching the property, included a detail that had not been reported at the time. "My crew was reluctant to continue working after we found the first few containers with unusual contents. The smell was terrible, even after months of being buried and burned. It wasn't like rotted grain or spoiled food. It was something else, something that reminded the older workers of battlefield conditions during the war. We completed the job, but several men quit before we finished, saying they couldn't stomach the work." The cleanup operation also revealed the extent of the excavation work that had been conducted in the barn over several years. The foundation area showed evidence of systematic digging and refilling, creating a complex network of underground chambers that extended well beyond the barn's walls. County surveyor Hampton Clay, who mapped the excavation sites, concluded that the work represented years of labor and had been conducted according to some type of organized plan. The excavation pattern suggests a deliberate design rather than random digging, Clay wrote in his survey report. The chambers were arranged in rows, each approximately 6 feet in length and 3 feet in width, separated by narrow earthen walls that would have provided structural support. The depth varied from 5 to 8 feet, and several chambers showed evidence of wooden lining that would have prevented water infiltration. The overall layout resembled nothing so much as a subterranean storage facility, though the purpose of such an elaborate construction remains unclear. Following the cleanup operation, the Bellamys property remained abandoned for several years. The partially burned main house was eventually demolished, and the land was sold to various buyers who attempted to establish normal agricultural operations. However, none of these ventures proved successful, and the property changed hands repeatedly throughout the early decades of the 20th century. Local residents developed a superstitious avoidance of the former Bellamy farm, claiming that livestock became agitated when brought near the property and that crops planted in the soil failed to thrive. These claims were generally dismissed as folklore until 1924, when agricultural scientist Dr. Harold Pemberton conducted soil analysis as part of a broader study of farming conditions in Appomattox County. Dr. Pemberton's findings, published in the Virginia Agricultural Quarterly in 1925, documented unusual chemical compositions in soil samples taken from the former barn site. Soil samples from the Bellamy property show elevated concentrations of calcium phosphate and other minerals consistent with organic decomposition. These concentrations are significantly higher than would be expected from normal agricultural use, and suggest that large quantities of organic material were buried and decomposed in this location over an extended period. More troubling was Dr. Pemberton's analysis of soil pH levels. The acidity of soil samples from the barn foundation area indicates prolonged exposure to decomposing organic matter. The chemical signature is consistent with the breakdown of protein-rich materials rather than the plant matter that would be expected from grain storage or normal agricultural composting. The distribution pattern of these chemicals throughout the excavated area suggests systematic burial of organic materials over a period of several years. Dr. Pemberton's report raised questions that led to renewed official interest in the Bellamy case. In 1926, County Sheriff Raymond Applegate reopened the investigation into the disappearances and unusual activities that had been reported at the farm during the 1890s. Sheriff Applegate's investigation, though hampered by the passage of time and the destruction of physical evidence, uncovered disturbing patterns that had not been apparent to earlier investigators. A review of county records from the 1890s reveals a significant increase in reported missing persons cases during the years when the Bellamy farm was most active, Sheriff Applegate wrote in his investigative summary. Between 1892 and 1899, 17 individuals were reported missing in Appomattox County and surrounding areas. This represents a marked increase over previous decades, when missing persons reports averaged fewer than 3 per year. Sheriff Applegate's investigation also revealed troubling patterns in the types of individuals who had disappeared. The missing persons were primarily transients, traveling workers, and individuals without strong family connections to the local community. Several were known to have been seeking employment at local farms during harvest seasons. In at least 4 cases, witnesses reported seeing the missing individuals in the vicinity of the old Richmond Pike, which passed directly by the Bellamy property. Most significantly, Sheriff Applegate's investigation uncovered evidence that Mordecai Bellamy had been actively recruiting temporary workers during the 1890s, despite his farm's relatively small size. Local employment records show that Bellamy regularly sought seasonal workers through advertisements in regional newspapers. Former workers who responded to these advertisements, but left before completing their employment, reported unusually demanding working conditions and strange requirements, including mandatory residence in the barn rather than traditional worker housing. One surviving account came from a laborer named Patrick McKenna, who had worked briefly at the Bellamy farm in 1896. McKenna, located in 1926 working at a shipyard in Norfolk, provided a disturbing description of his experiences. Bellamy required all workers to sleep in the barn, claiming it was more convenient for early morning duties. The barn was divided into sleeping quarters along the walls, with each worker assigned a specific area. The arrangement was unusual because the sleeping spaces were below ground level, accessed by wooden steps that led down into excavated chambers. McKenna continued, "What bothered me most was the requirement that workers remain on the property at all times during their employment period. Bellamy claimed this was necessary for security reasons, but he posted guards to ensure compliance. Workers who attempted to leave before completing their contracts simply disappeared. Bellamy would announce the next day that they had quit during the night, but their personal belongings remained in their assigned quarters. I left after 3 days, claiming a family emergency, and Bellamy did not attempt to prevent my departure. However, I later learned that several workers who had been employed there when I arrived were never seen again." Sheriff Applegate's investigation also uncovered financial records that suggested Mordecai Bellamy had been operating some type of business arrangement beyond normal farming activities. Bank records showed regular cash deposits that far exceeded what would be expected from the sale of agricultural products, and these deposits often coincided with the arrival of new workers at the farm. Between 1893 and 1898, Bellamy made cash deposits totaling nearly $300, an amount that represents several times the annual income of a typical farm operation in this county, Sheriff Applegate reported. The timing and amounts of these deposits suggest payment for services rendered, though the nature of these services remains unclear. Additionally, Bellamy made several large purchases of materials including lumber, lime, and metal fittings that would be consistent with underground construction projects. The investigation reached its conclusion in early 1927 when Sheriff Applegate issued his final report on the Bellamy case. While the report did not definitively prove criminal activity, it documented sufficient evidence to warrant a finding of probable cause. Based on the evidence gathered during this investigation, including witness testimony, financial records, and physical evidence from the property, there is probable cause to believe that criminal activities occurred at the Bellamy farm between 1892 and 1899. The pattern of missing persons, the unusual modifications to the barn structure, and the discovery of organic materials inconsistent with agricultural use suggest that the property may have been used for purposes that resulted in the deaths of multiple individuals. Sheriff Applegate's report concluded, unfortunately, the passage of time, the destruction of physical evidence in the 1899 fire, and the disappearance of the primary suspects make prosecution impossible. However, the evidence suggests that Mordecai Bellamy and his associates operated what can only be described as a murder enterprise, using the isolated location and agricultural cover of the farm to conceal their activities. The wooden containers observed by multiple witnesses were likely used to store the remains of victims, and the systematic excavation of the barn foundation created an underground burial ground that may have contained the remains of 17 or more individuals. The case was officially closed in 1927, but its impact on the local community persisted for decades. The former Bellamy property remained largely undeveloped, passing through various owners who found it unsuitable for agricultural or residential use. Local residents continued to report unusual phenomena at the site, including strange sounds during nighttime hours and the persistent smell of decomposition that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. In 1945, during World War II, the property was briefly considered as a site for a military training facility, but soil analysis revealed contamination that made it unsuitable for construction. The contamination was officially attributed to agricultural chemicals, but engineers familiar with the site privately expressed concerns that the soil composition suggested long-term organic decomposition on a massive scale. The property's dark history might have remained merely a local legend if not for a chance discovery in 1962. During construction of a new state highway that would pass near the former Bellamys farm, road crew workers uncovered what appeared to be an extensive network of underground chambers that extended far beyond the known boundaries of the barn foundation. Construction foreman Walter Hayes reported the discovery to state authorities, describing a complex system of interconnected tunnels and chambers that had been carefully excavated and reinforced with wooden supports. We found what looked like an underground city, with chambers large enough for a man to stand upright and passages connecting different areas. The whole system was built like it was meant to be permanent, with drainage channels and ventilation shafts. Some of the chambers still contained wooden containers similar to coffins but smaller, arranged in neat rows along the walls. The discovery prompted a formal archaeological investigation led by Dr. Margaret Whitfield of the Virginia Historical Society. Dr. Whitfield's team spent 6 months excavating and documenting the underground complex, revealing the full scope of the construction that had been undertaken at the Bellamys farm during the 1890s. The underground facility represents years of systematic excavation and construction, Dr. Whitfield reported in 1963. The complex includes more than 40 individual chambers, connected by a network of tunnels that extend over an area of approximately 2 acres. The construction technique demonstrates considerable engineering skill, with proper drainage and structural support that has allowed the facility to remain intact for more than 60 years. Dr. Whitfield's team made disturbing discoveries within the chambers. 37 chambers contained wooden containers that appear to have been used for burial purposes. The containers vary in size, but most are approximately 6 feet in length and show evidence of having been sealed with wax or pitch. Analysis of soil samples from within the containers reveals chemical signatures consistent with human decomposition, though the age and condition of the remains make positive identification impossible. The archaeological investigation also uncovered evidence that the underground complex had been designed with specific features that suggested its intended use. Several chambers contain metal fixtures and restraining devices that are consistent with confinement rather than storage. Additionally, the main tunnel system includes what appears to be a processing area with drainage channels and metal tables that show evidence of having been used for activities involving bodily fluids. Dr. Whitfield's final report, completed in late 1963, provided the most comprehensive analysis of the Bellamys case ever undertaken. Based on physical evidence, historical records, and chemical analysis, this investigation concludes that the Bellamys farm served as the site of systematic murder and body disposal operations between approximately 1892 and 1899. The underground facility was specifically designed to support these activities, with chambers for confinement, processing areas for body disposal, and a burial system capable of concealing multiple victims. The report estimated that the underground complex could have accommodated the remains of 50 or more individuals. The number of burial chambers, combined with evidence of multiple burials within individual containers, suggests that the operation may have resulted in significantly more deaths than previously estimated. The systematic nature of the facility indicates that the activities were conducted over an extended period and were planned with considerable forethought. Dr. Whitfield's investigation was concluded in 1964, and her findings were filed with state authorities. However, the report was classified as restricted access due to its disturbing content and the possibility that living relatives of victims might be identified. The underground complex was filled with concrete and sealed, and the highway construction was completed along an altered route that avoided the area entirely. The classification of Dr. Whitfield's report meant that public knowledge of the investigation's findings remained limited for several years. However, in 1967, investigative journalist Robert Aldrich of the Richmond Times-Dispatch obtained access to portions of the report through a Freedom of Information request and published a series of articles about the Bellamys case that brought national attention to the story. Aldrich's articles, published over 3 consecutive Sundays in November 1967, provided the first detailed public account of the investigation's findings. Dr. Whitfield's archaeological team has uncovered evidence of what may be the largest murder operation in Virginia's history, conducted over a period of 7 years in the 1890s at a farm that appeared to operate as a normal agricultural business. The systematic nature of the killings and the elaborate facility constructed to support them suggest a level of organization and planning that challenges conventional understanding of criminal behavior during that historical period. Aldrich's investigation also uncovered additional evidence that had not been included in the official reports. Interviews with descendants of families who lived in the area during the 1890s revealed that the Bellamys operation may have been part of a larger network of similar facilities. Several respondents reported family stories about other farms in the region where workers and transients disappeared under suspicious circumstances. These accounts suggest that the Bellamys farm may not have been an isolated case, but rather one component of a coordinated criminal enterprise. The publication of Aldrich's articles prompted renewed interest in the case from law enforcement agencies and academic researchers. In 1968, the Virginia State Police opened a cold case investigation into the disappearances associated with the Bellamys farm, though the passage of more than 70 years made the investigation largely academic in nature. Detective Captain Lawrence Morrison, who headed the state police investigation, focused on identifying possible victims through examination of missing persons reports from the 1890s. His investigation, completed in 1969, provided the most comprehensive victim profile ever assembled. Analysis of missing persons reports from Virginia, North Carolina, and West Virginia between 1892 and 1899 reveals 43 individuals who disappeared under circumstances consistent with the Bellamys operation. These individuals were primarily male between the ages of 20 and 50 and were either unemployed laborers seeking work or transient workers moving between seasonal employment. Detective Morrison's report also identified patterns that suggested the scope of the operation. The geographical distribution of disappearances indicates that victims were recruited from a wide area, with some traveling more than 100 miles to reach the Bellamys farm. This suggests an organized recruitment system that may have included accomplices in multiple locations. Additionally, the timing of disappearances correlates with agricultural seasons when demand for temporary workers would be highest, indicating that the operation was designed to take advantage of normal labor migration patterns. The state police investigation concluded that the Bellamys case represented a form of criminal enterprise that was unprecedented in the historical record. The systematic nature of the operation, the elaborate facility constructed to support it, and the large number of potential victims suggest that Mordecai Bellamys and his associates developed what can only be described as an industrialized murder operation. The use of agricultural cover and the targeting of transient workers created conditions that allowed the operation to continue for years without detection. Detective Morrison's final report, submitted in December 1969, provided closure to the official investigation, while acknowledging that many questions remained unanswered. The evidence clearly establishes that multiple homicides occurred at the Bellamys farm during the 1890s, and that the victims were disposed of in an underground facility that was specifically constructed for this purpose. However, the identities of most victims, the exact number of deaths, and the ultimate fate of Mordecai Bellamys and his associates remain unknown. The case represents one of the most significant unsolved criminal enterprises in Virginia's history. Today, the former site of the Bellamys farm appears as an unremarkable section of rural Virginia countryside. The highway construction project was completed along its altered route, and the property has been divided into small residential lots that show no obvious signs of their dark history. However, local residents occasionally report unusual phenomena that seem to echo the property's past. Real estate agent Patricia Hensley, who has handled sales of property in the area since 1985, notes that lots on the former Bellamys land consistently sell for below market value and experience high turnover rates. Families who build homes there don't seem to stay very long. They complain about problems with basements flooding, foundation settling, and strange odors that seem to come from the ground itself. Most people don't know the history of the area when they buy, but something about the place seems to affect people. County records show that 11 houses have been built on the former Bellamys property since 1970, but only 3 are currently occupied by their original owners. The others have been sold multiple times, often after brief periods of occupancy. Several former residents have reported persistent problems with well water that develops an unusual taste and odor despite repeated testing and treatment. Margaret Chen, who lived on the property from 2010 to 2012, described experiences that seemed to echo the site's history. We started having problems with the basement almost immediately after moving in. Water would seep through the foundation walls, even during dry periods, and it always had a terrible smell. We had contractors examine the basement multiple times, and they all said the foundation was sound, but the moisture problems persisted. The smell was the worst part. It was like something rotting underneath the house. Chen also reported disturbances that seemed to have no natural explanation. At night, we would hear sounds that seemed to come from below the basement floor. It was rhythmic, like digging or scraping, but it would stop whenever we went downstairs to investigate. Our dog refused to go into the basement at all and would become agitated whenever we opened the basement door. We finally moved out because the problems were affecting our health and peace of mind. The Bellamys case has become a subject of academic study among criminologists and historians interested in understanding how such extensive criminal activity could have remained undetected for so long. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley of the University of Virginia, who has written extensively about the case, argues that it represents an early example of organized serial killing that predates more well-known cases by several decades. The Bellamys operation demonstrates a level of sophistication and systematic organization that challenges conventional timelines for the development of serial murder. Dr. Hartley wrote in her 2015 study, "The elaborate underground facility, the organized recruitment of victims, and the systematic disposal of remains indicate planning and execution that was far ahead of its time. The case suggests that our understanding of criminal development in the late 19th century may be incomplete." Dr. Hartley's research also explores the social conditions that allowed the operation to continue undetected. The isolation of rural communities, the mobility of seasonal workers, and the general lack of systematic law enforcement created an environment where such activities could flourish. The Bellamys farm operated as what we would now recognize as a systematic killing operation, but the social and legal structures of the 1890s were inadequate to detect or prevent such activities. The academic interest in the Bellamys case has led to additional research that has uncovered evidence of similar operations in other parts of the rural South during the same period. Dr. Michael Torres of Duke University has identified at least 6 other properties in Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee where similar patterns of disappearances and suspicious activities were reported during the 1890s. The Bellamys case may not have been unique, Dr. Torres concluded in his 2018 research. Documentary evidence suggests that similar operations were conducted at isolated farms throughout the region during the economic disruption following Reconstruction. The mobility of desperate workers seeking employment created opportunities for predators who could operate with minimal risk of detection. The legacy of the Bellamys farm continues to influence the local community more than a century after the disappearances occurred. Area schools teach the case as part of local history curricula, emphasizing the importance of community vigilance and the protection of vulnerable populations. The Appomattox County Historical Society maintains an archive of materials related to the case, though access is restricted due to the sensitive nature of the content. Sheriff David Blackwood, who currently heads law enforcement in Appomattox County, views the Bellamys case as a reminder of the ongoing need for vigilance in protecting vulnerable community members. The case demonstrates how isolation and economic desperation can create conditions where predators can operate undetected. While our law enforcement capabilities have improved dramatically since the 1890s, the fundamental vulnerabilities that allowed the Bellamys operation to succeed still exist in different forms today. The physical evidence of the Bellamys operation has been permanently sealed beneath concrete and earth, but the psychological impact of the case continues to resonate. Local mental health professionals report that residents of the area occasionally seek treatment for anxiety related to living near the former site, and real estate developers have learned to avoid marketing properties based on their historical significance. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a psychologist who has studied the community impact of the case, notes that the Bellamys story has become part of the collective memory of the region. The case represents a fundamental violation of community trust and safety that continues to influence how people think about their environment. Even residents who are not consciously aware of the details feel an underlying uneasiness about the area that affects their sense of security. As the investigation files from the 1960s approach the statutory limit for classified materials, historians anticipate that additional details about the case may become available to researchers. However, many of the key questions about the Bellamys operation remain unanswered and may never be resolved due to the passage of time and the destruction of evidence. The wooden containers that were buried in the barn, the underground chambers that housed unknown numbers of victims, and the systematic disposal of human remains represent a level of organized criminal activity that challenges our understanding of both historical crime patterns and human capacity for evil. The case serves as a reminder that the most horrifying stories are often those that remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life, concealed by the very normalcy that makes them possible. Today, when travelers pass through Appomattox County along the modern highway that skirts the former Bellamys property, they see rolling hills, farming communities, and the peaceful countryside of rural Virginia. Few are aware that beneath their feet lies evidence of one of the most systematic and extensive murder operations in American history. The silence that once protected the Bellamys operation now preserves the memory of its victims, whose names and stories were lost along with their lives in that remote barn where the coffins were buried in earth that still refuses to forget.